11 days before my granddaughter's wedding, the jeweler on our town square turned his sign around, locked the door with me still inside, set her engagement ring under his loupe and said, "Dale, before you say one word, you need to see what I was paid to erase." Inside that band, half buffed away, was another woman's initial and a date not even a year and a half old. So I will ask you what I asked myself standing at that counter with my hat still in my hand. What do you do when the ring on your granddaughter's finger is carrying somebody else's love story, and the man who put it there paid cash to have it sanded out before the wedding? My name is Dale Whitaker. I am 76 years old, and for better than 50 years, I was a carpenter in the North Georgia foothills, framing houses in the summer heat and hanging doors in the winter cold, in a little town called Cedar Ford that you will not find on any map because I have changed the names in this story to protect the people in it. Before we go on, do me one small favor. When you get a minute, leave me a comment and tell me what you hear when you stand at your window tonight. Crickets or traffic. I ask because I have learned that the folks who gather around stories like this one come from every kind of quiet and every kind of noise, and an old man likes to picture where his voice is landing. Now let me take you back to that Tuesday morning, because I want you to stand where I stood. Marty Kessler has run the jewelry and watch repair shop on our square for 40 years. He is a small, careful man with a magnifying visor pushed up on his forehead and a green felt pad on his counter that has held more of this county's history than the newspaper has. Wedding bands, christening spoons, pocket watches that came home from wars. I had known him since we were both young men with dark hair, and in all that time I had never once seen him lock that door during business hours. He did it that morning without a word. Then he walked behind the counter, laid down the felt, and set my granddaughter's engagement ring in the middle of it like it was evidence, which, as it turned out, it was. He told me the ring had come in 2 days earlier for resizing. The man who brought it in wanted it snugged down half a size, and he wanted the inside of the band polished smooth. Rush job, cash, no receipt needed. Marty said that last part twice. No receipt needed. In 40 years behind that counter, he told me, the only men who ever said that were men who did not want their names attached to a thing. Now, Marty photographs every piece that crosses his counter. He has done it since the 70s for insurance, a little habit as regular as breathing. So before he touched that ring with a polishing wheel, he had already put it under the camera. And under the loop on the inside of that band was an engraving that somebody had already started grinding down once before, somewhere else, by a rougher hand than Marty's. You could still read it if you knew how to look. A single letter R, the word always, and a date, 17 months back. I stood there and did the arithmetic in my head, and my stomach went down through the floorboards. 17 months ago, the man engaged to my granddaughter had not yet met my granddaughter. 17 months ago, by his own telling, he was in Charlotte, building other people's retirement accounts and grieving the grandmother whose ring, he said, this had been. A grandmother's ring does not carry a fresh date and a stranger's initial. A grandmother's ring does not get its history sanded off in 2 different towns. I want to be honest with you about what I did next, because it matters to everything that came after. I did not drive to the sheriff. Some of you are hollering at me already, and I understand it. But stand at that counter with me a minute. A polished ring is not a crime. A cash payment is not a crime. A lie about a grandmother is a sin, but they do not book you for it. I had a photograph of an engraving and a bad feeling, and my granddaughter Nora was floating around town like her feet had come off the ground, happier than I had seen her since before her daddy died. If I hollered fraud with nothing in my hands but a jeweler's snapshot, 2 things were going to happen. She was going to choose him, and he was going to know I was looking. I had spent 50 years crawling under other people's houses, and if I learned one thing under there, it is this. When you find the soft spot in a sill, you do not stomp on it to show everybody. You mark it quiet, and you find out how far the rot runs before you say a word to the man who owns the house. So I asked Marty for a print of that photograph. He gave me 2. And then I put my hat on, and I walked out into the sunshine and waved at 2 neighbors and drove my truck home with my hands steady on the wheel and a hole opening up in the middle of my chest. Let me tell you who we are, so you understand what was sitting on the other side of the scale. I was born right there in Tyler County. My daddy was a carpenter before me, and the only thing of any value he left behind was his spirit-level rosewood and brass, bought second-hand the year I was born. He taught me to read the bubble in that glass vial before he taught me to read words. He used to set it on a windowsill and say, "Son, the bubble does not care how pretty the paint is." I have carried that level onto every job of my life. It hangs on 2 pegs over my workbench, and it is the truest thing I own. My wife June and I raised 1 boy, Tommy, in a house I framed with my own hands, on 40 acres. My daddy left me. Tommy grew up to be an electrician, a better one than I was a carpenter, and he married and gave us Nora. When Nora was 14, Tommy was killed on the highway coming home from a job outside Atlanta. A tired trucker crossed the center line, and that was the whole story. Her mother remarried a few years on and moved out to Arizona, and nobody blamed her, but Nora would not leave Toller County. She finished growing up in our house, in her daddy's old room. June taught her to put up peaches. I taught her to swing a hammer and to read that bubble. She used to stand on a paint bucket at my bench, 8 years old, holding my daddy's level against everything in the shop, hollering, "This one is true! This one is not!" June died 6 years ago, and after that it was Nora and me. She is 27 now, and she runs the children's room at the county library, and when she laughs, you can hear June in it so clear it will stop your heart. And here is the part you need to know, because it is the part a certain kind of man can smell from 3 counties away. When Tommy died, there was a life insurance payout. Nora's share, invested careful and left alone for 13 years, along with everything that girl saved out of every paycheck she ever earned, had grown to right around $260,000. It was sitting in a certificate of deposit at the Farmers and Merchants Bank, and it was set to come due at the end of that very month. Her daddy's blood money, she called it once, and she would not touch it. She was saving it, she said, for a life worth spending it on. That spring, a life worth spending it on had walked into the library fundraiser wearing a blazer the color of sand and a smile you could pour over pancakes, and introduced himself as Chase Merrill. He was 38 years old, or so he said, a retirement income advisor, or so he said, new to the area, tired of Charlotte, looking for a slower life and a front porch, or so he said. I want you to notice something about every fact I just gave you. Every single one of them came out of his own mouth. That is a thing I did not notice for far too long, and it is the first thing I would tell any parent or grandparent listening to me tonight. Pay attention to how much of what you know about a new person arrived by only one road. Within a month, he was sitting in June's chair at my Sunday table. Within 3, he had spoken at the Senior Fellowship Hall about protecting your nest egg from scammers, and half the church wanted to hand him their savings out of gratitude. That detail still makes me laugh in a way that has no joy in it. The wolf gave a seminar on wolves, and we passed a collection plate, and within 5 months he was down on one knee in my front yard under the oak Tommy used to climb with a ring and a little velvet box, and Nora said yes before he got the question all the way out. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of October. Then, in the first week of September, it was suddenly moved up to the last Saturday of September because the venue had a cancellation, he said, and why wait when you know, he said. Nobody but me seemed to do the arithmetic on what else was happening at the end of September. A certificate of deposit coming due like fruit ripening on a fence post, right where anybody could reach it. But I am getting ahead of myself. On that Tuesday morning, standing in Marty's shop with those 2 photographs folded into my breast pocket, I did not know any of what was coming. I only knew one thing for certain, and I learned it off the inside of a ring. Whoever Chase Merrill was, he had not started with us, and men like that do not stop on their own. That first week, I made the mistake I want to warn you about, the one I suspect half the parents listening to this have either made or come close to making. I got angry, and I let the anger pick the moment instead of letting the evidence pick it. It was the following Sunday. Nora brought him to supper like always, and he sat in June's chair like always, and he complimented my pot roast like a man reading off a card. And I sat there watching him butter a roll with those soft, manicured hands, and the photograph in my shirt pocket felt like it was burning through the cloth. So I started asking questions. Where in Charlotte was your office exactly? Which firm held your licenses? Your grandmother, the one whose ring that was, what was her name? Where is she buried? I would love to pay my respects someday. I thought I was being clever. I was about as clever as a dog barking at a locked door. He answered every single question without one hitch in his voice. The office was on Trade Street, but the firm had folded in the downturn, which is why he went independent. His licenses were in good standing, and he would be delighted to show me his credentials, he said. Delighted, like I had offered him a gift. And his grandmother. His grandmother was named Rose, he said, and he smiled a little sad smile and turned the ring gently on Nora's finger and said, that is why the R inside the band. R for Rose. He said he had asked the jeweler to polish the engraving because his grandmother believed a ring should carry the couple that wears it, not the ghosts that came before. Nora put her hand over her heart. I nearly dropped my fork. You see what he did there? I had not said one word about any engraving. I had not told a soul what Marty showed me. But he knew that ring had been under a loop in a small town where the jeweler knew my family, and so he walked ahead of the story and planted his flag on it first, in front of Nora, wrapped in his dead grandmother. A man who does that is not lying the way you and I lie, friends, clumsy and sweating. He is doing carpentry. He saw the soft spot the same as I did, and he shimmed it before the floor could squeak. That night, I could not sleep, and I did something worse. I went to Nora directly. I sat her down in my kitchen, under the clock. June wound every Sunday of her life, and I told her plain that something about Chase did not sit level with me. I said it just like that. He does not sit level, honey. And I watched my granddaughter, the child I taught to read a bubble, look at me with June's own eyes gone hard, and she said, "Grandpa, you have been against this from the start because you cannot stand for anything to change." She said, "He warned me you might do this. He said men your age sometimes get suspicious of younger men, that it comes with the years, like arthritis." She was quoting him. And the worst part, the part that kept me up staring at the ceiling fan, is that for a good long minute I wondered if he was right. That is what that kind of man does. He does not just lie to you, he gets inside your ear and files down your trust in your own plumb line until you would swear the crooked wall is straight and the straight one is crooked. She left with her chin up and her eyes wet, and she did not come by for 9 days. In 60 years of loving that family, those were 9 of the longest days I ever walked through. It was Marty who pulled me out of a ditch. He came to the house, which he had never once done in 40 years, carrying a manila envelope. Inside was the photograph, blown up big and printed clean, the R and the word always and the date sharp as a chisel line, and underneath it was a slip of paper with a name and a phone number in Marty's small jeweler's hand. Curtis Boone. Marty said, "Dale, my cousin used this man when her husband emptied their accounts. He is a retired deputy out of Hall County. He is licensed, he is patient, and he does everything by the book, and the by the book part matters, because if this goes where you and I both think it goes, you will want every piece of it to stand up in a courtroom, not get thrown out because 2 old fools played detective." I have thought a lot about why Marty stuck his neck out, and I will tell you the answer he gave me himself months later over coffee. He said, 40 years, people brought me their whole lives across that counter, and I polished them and kept my mouth shut. This one I could not polish. I called Curtis Boone the next morning from the phone in my shop, with the doors shut. He came out to the house 2 days later, a heavy-set man about 60 with a gray mustache and the stillness of a fellow who has sat through 1,000 hours of other people's worst moments. He listened to the whole thing without touching his coffee. Then he asked me one question. He said, "Mr. Whitaker, what is your goal here? Because if your goal is to be right, that is cheap, and you can have it today. But if your goal is to get your granddaughter to the far side of this with her money and her heart still mostly in one piece, that is a different job, and it is slower, and you will have to do some things that feel backwards." I told him my goal was Nora. All of it, only that. He nodded like a man checking a measurement, and then he laid out the backwards part. "First," he said, "you are frozen out right now, and frozen out is blind. You need to get back inside that house, back inside the wedding, whatever it costs your pride. Apologize. Lay it on thick. Be the sweet old man who let his worry run away with him. Men like this one feed on being forgiven. It makes them feel bulletproof, and bulletproof men get careless. Second," he said, "you give me everything you have, and then you stop investigating completely. No more questions at supper. No more looking up firms in Charlotte. If he made you as a threat once, he is watching you now, and one more bark out of you, and he will either speed everything up or vanish and take her with him to somewhere you cannot follow. You go back to being furniture, Mr. Whitaker. Old, harmless, apologizing furniture. I want to tell you plainly, that went down like a mouthful of sawdust. My daddy did not raise me to grovel to a man I knew was rotten. But my daddy also used to say that pride is a fine finish and a poor foundation. So the next evening I drove to Nora's little rented house on Persimmon Street, and I stood on her porch with my hat in my hands and I performed. There is no prettier word for it. I told her I was a lonesome old man who had gotten scared of losing the last person he had, and that her Chase had been nothing but kind to me, and that I was ashamed. Some of it was even true, which is what made it work. The best lies I ever told in my life. I told that September, and I am not proud of a single one of them, and I would tell every one of them again before breakfast. Nora cried and hugged my neck, and over her shoulder, in the doorway, I watched Chase Merrill smile at me, warm as a heat lamp, and I understood that he had already forgiven me too, because I had just handed him the thing he wanted most. Proof that the last dog watching the henhouse had gone back to sleep. And then I went one better, exactly like Curtis told me to. I offered up the home place for the rehearsal dinner. Friday evening, the night before the wedding, long tables under the oak, the whole wedding party on both sides of the aisle, such as his side was. "Let me do this one thing," I said, "for Tommy and for June." Chase lit up like a man who had just been handed the deed to the county. Of course he did. A man selling a story about marrying into deep roots in old land could not have ordered a better stage set from a catalog. He thought I was giving him a stage. I was building him a scaffold, and I do not mean the kind you hang drywall from. 2 days after I ate my crow on Persimmon Street, Curtis Boone called my shop phone. He said 4 words, and I had to sit down on the sawhorse. He said, I found the R. Her name was Renee. She lived up in Chattanooga, about 2 hours north of us, and she managed the office of a heating and air company. 14 months before Chase Merrill knelt in my front yard, a man had knelt in hers, same build, same easy voice, same line of work, more or less. Up there, he had called himself an investment consultant, and he had gone by a different last name. And Curtis found her the honest way, which I want to spell out because it matters to me that you know nobody hacked anything or bribed anybody in this story. Marty's photograph had the date. Curtis took that date and that first initial and worked through public records, newspaper engagement announcements, court filings. You can look up at any county clerk's office for the cost of copies. It is slow, and it is boring, and it is all legal, and it took him most of 2 weeks. People think the truth is hidden in some locked computer somewhere. Most of the time, friends, the truth is sitting in a courthouse file folder waiting for one stubborn person to come ask for it. Renee agreed to meet us at a diner outside Chattanooga on a Thursday morning. I told Nora I was driving up to look at a lumber auction, which had the advantage of being a thing I had actually done a dozen times. Renee was younger than I expected, early 40s, careful with her makeup, and her hands did not stop moving the whole hour. Folding the napkin, squaring the silverware, lining up the sugar packets. A person putting small things straight because the big thing would not go. She told us it had been a whirlwind, flowers at her office, a proposal inside 4 months, and the ring, my friends, the ring in her story had belonged to his late mother. Not grandmother that time, mother. I suppose even a careful man economizes somewhere. Right after the engagement came the money talk, and it arrived wearing the same Sunday clothes it would later wear in Cedar Ford. Sweetheart, you work too hard for this money to be sitting still. Sweetheart, let me consolidate this for you. It is literally what I do all day. She moved most of her savings, right around $90,000, into what he called their engagement account, a joint account, because his name on it next to hers was, he said, a promise in writing. 6 weeks before the wedding, she came home to a closet with no suits in it. The account was empty, the phone was disconnected, and the office address on his business card turned out to be a mailbox store between a nail salon and a sandwich shop. She never reported it. I want you to hear why, because this is the part that keeps men like him in business. She said, who was I going to tell, Mr. Whitaker? It was a joint account. His name was on it. I put it there myself with a notary watching. The police would say I gave a gift to my fiancée and the gift went bad. And every soul at my church would know I was the biggest fool in Hamilton County. She looked out the window a while, and then she said the sentence that has stayed with me every day since. She said, he did not steal my money first. He stole my say-so first, and then the money just followed it out the door. He did not steal the money first. He stole the say-so first. If you take one sentence away from this whole story, take that one, because that is how it is done to smart people every single day in this country. And I will tell you the truth. My blood was cold the whole drive down out of Tennessee because I finally understood the shape of the thing. This was not a man who fell in love fast. This was a man with a route, like a milkman, and my Nora was just the next porch on it. Right in the middle of that lunch, my cell phone buzzed on the diner table, and I looked down, and the name on it was Chase. I let it ring twice while my heart tried to climb out through my shirt. Renee saw the name upside down and went white as the napkin she was folding. I answered it at the booth because a man who does not answer is a man with something to hide. And that voice came pouring out, warm and easy. Dale, my friend, where have you got to? I stopped by the shop and the truck was gone. Just checking on you, buddy. Nora worries. Woo! Checking on me. You understand what that call was. That was a man counting his hens. I looked out at the parking lot of a diner 2 hours from home, sitting across from the last woman he had skinned, and I said, oh, I am up at a lumber auction, son. You would be bored silly. Overpriced walnut and old men arguing about it. And he laughed, and I laughed, and we were just two fellows who loved the same girl, and when I hung up, my hand was not shaking, and that frightened me more than if it had been. You can get good at this. Nobody warned you about that part. Renee said she would think about talking to the police in Tennessee. That was all she could promise that day, and I did not push her. You do not lean on a cracked joist and expect it to hold. You sister it up alongside first, and you let it take weight slow. Now I have to tell you about the land because while Curtis was working his files, Chase had opened up a second front, and I would be lying if I said it did not tell me exactly how big his appetite was. It started gentle, the way all of it started gentle. At Sunday supper, him leaning back with his coffee saying, Dale, this place is really something. 40 acres this close to the state highway. You ever had it appraised just for insurance purposes? Then a week or so on, walking the fence line with me real casual, saying developers were paying silly money for road frontage in the next county over, and it would be a shame for the family not to know what it was sitting on. The family. Him with the wedding still weeks off, already saying you like he had a key. And then the third pass, the one with the teeth in it. He said, "You know, Dale, at your age, God bless you. It might be worth getting the estate paperwork tightened up so Nora never has to deal with probate court while she is grieving." He said, "I could recommend somebody." He said it kind. They always say it kind. What Chase Merrill did not know, because it never occurred to him to wonder, was that the estate paperwork had been tightened up for 11 years. The year after we lost Tommy, June and I sat down with a lawyer here in town, a sharp, unhurried woman named Judith Lanier, and we signed and recorded what is called a life estate deed on the home place. Now I am an old carpenter and not a lawyer, and the rules run different from state to state, so hear this as one man's story and not as advice, and go see somebody like Judith before you touch your own. But the plain English of ours was this. The 40 acres in the house already belonged to Nora, on paper, recorded at the courthouse for anybody to look up. What June and I kept back was the right to live on it and use it for as long as either of us was breathing. That is the life estate. Nobody could sell that land. Nobody could borrow $1 against it. Nobody could so much as move a fence post off it without my signature while I lived. And no bank on this green earth would lend money against the leftover piece of it either, not with an old man's heartbeat standing between them and the dirt. So all those weeks, while that young man was walking my fence line in his clean boots, measuring my road frontage with his eyes, doing his arithmetic on my age, he was pricing a wall he could never own. The paint on the ladder was dry before he ever put his foot on it. And I walked beside him the whole way, pointing out where the creek floods in the spring, letting him dream. I will confess, that gave me one mean little spark of comfort. But it burned out quick, because the land was never really where the fire was headed. The land takes lawyers and years. The certificate of deposit takes his signature. $260,000 coming due the Tuesday after the wedding, and 1 week into October, Nora told me at the library, glowing, that Chase had already set up an appointment at the bank for the Monday they got back from the honeymoon to roll her CD into what he was calling their family foundation account. Joint, of course. His name next to hers, of course. A promise in writing, he called it. The same words, friends. The very same words he used on Renee 14 months earlier in another state. When Curtis heard that, he pulled at his mustache and said the only thing I ever heard him say that sounded like emotion. He said, "Mr. Whitaker, we are not watching a man fall in love. We are watching a man load a truck." And we had until the last Saturday of September to unload it. Then, 12 days out from the wedding, on a Wednesday evening while I was oiling my daddy's level at the workbench, the phone rang, and it was Curtis, and there was something in his voice I had not heard before. He said, "Dale, are you sitting down?" I have been doing this work 11 years, and I want you to hear what came back on this boy's real name. Now, friends, if you have ever had to stand guard over somebody who did not know they needed guarding, if you have ever loved a person right through the middle of their anger at you, then you and I are cut from the same board, and I would be honored to have you subscribe to this channel, because what I am about to tell you is the reason everything you have heard so far was worth it. Because what Curtis Boone had found was bigger than a recycled ring and bigger than a joint account. Chase Merrill was not his name. His born legal government name, was Darrell Ott. Chase Merrill had existed on paper for barely 3 years, which is about when Darrell Ott seems to have decided that his own history had gotten too heavy to carry, and Curtis had followed the old name backwards, county by county, courthouse by courthouse, the same slow legal way. There was a civil judgment against him in North Carolina from an older couple who had trusted him with a retirement rollover that rolled all the way to nowhere. There was the engagement in Chattanooga, which you know about. And then, at the bottom of the stack, there was a piece of paper from a courthouse in Alabama that stopped my heart cold. A marriage license. Darrell Ott married 9 years ago to a woman named Sandra in a little ceremony at a county courthouse in Alabama. And here is the part I need you to sit with, the way I had to sit with it on my sawhorse with the phone against my ear. There was no divorce, not in that county, not in any county he had lived in since, and Curtis checked every one of them, one clerk's office at a time, and then he hired a record search across the state to be certain. Darrell Ott had walked away from Sandra the same way he later walked away from Renee, except he had never bothered to untie the legal knot. Why would he? Untying it costs money and leaves a paper trail. And Chase Merrill, the brand new man with the sand-colored blazer, had no knots at all. Which meant the wedding my granddaughter had circled on her calendar, the dress hanging on her closet door the last Saturday of September under the oak at the venue hall, all of it was pointed at a marriage that would be no marriage at all. The man was already somebody's husband. And a man who knowingly stands up and marries a second wife while the first marriage is still standing has not just broken a heart, he has committed a crime. Bigamy is a felony, plain and simple, and on top of it, every paper he signed is Chase Merrill, The license application he had already filled out was a lie told to a court. And oh friends, the license. I have to tell you about the license because the good Lord does have a sense of humor. In Georgia, you do not get your marriage license at some city hall window. You get it from the probate court, the same office that handles wills and estates and looks after people who cannot look after themselves. Nora and Chase had driven to the county seat holding hands and picked up their license from the probate judge's office, and that man had signed his brand new fake name to it under oath, in the one building in this county where the truth about him would eventually have to come home to roost. He walked past a room full of public records to tell his lie, and not one soul knew to pull a file. That is not the courthouse's fault. Courthouses answer the questions they are asked. It is on us, the fathers and the grandfathers and the mothers and the friends, to go and ask. The next morning, Curtis and I sat down in Judith Lanier's office with the whole stack, and Judith read every page without a word, in that unhurried way of hers, while the clock on her wall ticked. Then she took her glasses off and she said, "Gentlemen, I want to be very clear about what we have and what we do not have. What we have is proof that this man is not who he says he is, that he is legally married to another woman, and that the marriage happening Saturday would be void from the first word out of the preacher's mouth. What we do not have is a Georgia crime that has already been completed. The account has not been touched. The wedding has not happened. If you take this to the sheriff today, it is a stack of paper about a man from somewhere else, and the best you get is a hard conversation and a spooked con man who is gone by morning, and gone men come back with new names. But," she said, and she held up one finger, "there are 2 clocks ticking that he does not know about. The first one is in Tennessee, because Renee had done it. 2 days after our lunch at that diner, she had walked into a police station in Hamilton County with her bank records and sworn out a report. And the detective up there had taken one look at the pattern and gotten a felony theft warrant started. That warrant was real, it was active, and it had Darrell Ott's name on it. The second clock, Judith said, was Saturday itself. The moment he stood up in front of witnesses and tried to marry Nora under a false name while married to Sandra, he would be committing a brand new felony right here in our county in front of 200 people. So there it was, laid out on Judith's table like a set of blueprints. We could let it get to Saturday and have him arrested at the altar, in front of Nora in her dress, in front of the whole county, a memory that would follow that girl into every good thing she ever tried to do afterwards. Or we could end it Friday night, at my table, under my oak. At the rehearsal dinner he thought was his stage, with the people who loved Nora close enough to catch her when she fell. I chose Friday, and I will never regret it. If it was going to break my granddaughter's heart, and it was, then it was going to break in her grandfather's yard, with her Aunt Patsy on one side of her and June's old choir friends on the other, and not in a rented hall with a photographer charging by the hour. Curtis made one phone call to a man he had worked beside for 20 years, an investigator with our county sheriff's office name of Pell. And Investigator Pell did it all correct. He verified the Tennessee warrant. He talked to the district attorney's office. He agreed that Friday evening he and one deputy would be up at the top of my drive, quiet, no lights, and that nothing would move until I gave a sign unless the man tried to run. It was, Pell said, the calmest fugitive apprehension anybody had ever invited him to, and he had been to a few. And then there was nothing left to do but get ready to host a party. Those last 3 days were the strangest of my life. I planed boards for the long tables in my shop while my hands did the work and my mind ran in circles. I strung June's white party lights in the oak. I stood at my bench, oiling my daddy's level, and I thought about the day Tommy was born and the day we buried him, and the way Nora used to stand on that paint bucket hollering, "This one is true! This one is not!" There was one bad night, I will admit it to you, the Wednesday before, when I sat in the dark kitchen at 2 in the morning and nearly picked up the phone to call the whole thing off and just tell her, blurt it out, evidence be hanged, because keeping it from her felt like lying, and lying to Nora felt like dying. I sat there a long time with Tommy's picture, the one of him on a ladder grinning with a wire stripper in his teeth, and I asked him out loud what he would do. And I could hear him plain as Sunday. He said, "Daddy, you have already measured this thing 5 times. Cut it." Friday came down golden and warm, the way late September in Georgia can when it wants to apologize for August. The table stood in 2 long rows under the oak, and I had built them myself that week, sawhorses and clear pine, planed smooth as a church pew. Before the caterer showed up, before anybody, I did one last thing alone. I took my daddy's level down off its pegs, and I walked the length of both those tables and set it on them, section by section, and I watched that bubble settle dead center every time. Nothing else standing in my yard that evening was going to be true. But by God, the table was. The first headlights came up the drive at 6 o'clock. His silver coupe, washed and shining, with my granddaughter waving out the window, happier than the law should allow. And walking on my own gravel with a casserole in her hands came a guest Nora had never met. Curtis introduced her around as a friend of the family from Tennessee. Her name was Renee. I will carry that evening with me to the end of my days, every minute of it. The smell of fried chicken and cut grass, the white lights coming on in the oak as the sky went purple, the sound of 40 people who loved my granddaughter laughing at long tables I had planed with my own hands, and him at the center of it, pouring sweet tea for June's choir friends, telling the story about his grandmother Rose to a fresh audience, patting my shoulder every time he passed like I was a good old hound. I let him have all of it. Every minute. A man's last easy evening ought to be a nice one. When the plates were cleared and the banana pudding was going around, I stood up at the head of the table and tapped my glass, and the yard went quiet, and Nora looked up at me with her chin on her hands, glowing, waiting for her grandpa to say something sweet. I said, "Most of you know I was a carpenter for 50 years, and my daddy before me, and my daddy left me one thing when he passed, a rosewood level, and he taught me that the bubble does not care how pretty the paint is. I have checked every board I ever trusted against that level." And I said, "Tonight, before this family gets any bigger, there is one more thing that needs checking, and I am too old to do it anyway but out loud." And I looked down that table at him and I said, "Son, why don't you tell everybody your name? You could have heard a moth land." He laughed, easy as ever, and said, "Dale, have you been into the cooking sherry?" And a few folks chuckled, nervous. And I reached into my shirt pocket and took out Marty's photograph, blown up clean, and I laid it on the table and slid it down to Nora. And I said, "That is the inside of your ring, honey," before he paid cash to have another woman's initial polished out of it. There is no grandmother named Rose. There is a woman up in Chattanooga whose ring that was 17 months ago. He stood up then, still smooth, still reaching for the wheel, saying, "Sweetheart, I told you he might do something like this. I told you." And honest to goodness, he almost had traction because she wanted so badly not to believe me. And that was the moment Renee set down her tea glass and stood up at the far end of the table and said, "My name is Renee, and 14 months ago I was engaged to this man, except his name was different then, and my $90,000 had his name on it too, right up until the morning he disappeared with it." The color did not drain out of his face. I want to be accurate because I was watching him the way I would watch a load-bearing wall with a crack running up it. What drained out of him was the performance. The warmth shut off like a tap. And what was left standing at my table in a linen jacket was nobody at all. A frame with no house on it. Judith Lanier rose next, unhurried as always, and she did not raise her voice. She said, "Nora, honey, I am so sorry, but you need to hear 3 sentences of law tonight. The man beside you is legally named Darrell Ott. 9 years ago, he married a woman named Sandra in the state of Alabama, and no court anywhere has ever dissolved that marriage. If he stands up with you tomorrow, it is not a wedding, it is a felony, and every paper he has signed in this county under the name Chase Merrill, including your marriage license application at the probate court, is a lie told under oath." My granddaughter looked at the photograph, then she looked at Renee, then she looked at him, and she asked him one question, so quiet I nearly missed it. She said, "Is your name Darrell?" And friends, here is the thing I did not expect, the thing I still turn over in my hands on porch evenings. He could have run one more play. He had run them all night, all year, all his life. But something in him when that girl asked him his own name at a table full of witnesses folded up shop. Maybe it was Renee's eyes on him. Maybe even a man like that gets tired of carrying an empty frame around. He looked at Nora, and after a long breath he said, "My name is Darrell." And then, "So help me." He said the only fully true sentence I ever heard out of his mouth. He said, "The money was the job, but you made the job easy to like," which is as close to a love letter as his kind can write, and I hope she someday weighs it as the confession it was, and nothing more. I raised my hand then, just lifted it, the sign we'd agreed on, and Investigator Pell came walking down out of the dark of the drive, with a deputy beside him, no lights, no shouting, just 2 men in jackets moving quiet through a stunned crowd. Pell told him about the Tennessee warrant in a voice you would use to discuss rain. And I stepped in close, because I had earned one private sentence, and I said to him, "Son, you can walk to that car on your own feet past these people, or you can make it worse, but I will tell you something first. Somewhere back down your road before all this, somebody probably failed you bad enough that you decided everybody else would pay for it forever. That is a debt you are collecting from the wrong accounts. It is not too late to close the books. It is only late." He walked out on his own feet. At the top of the drive, with the deputy's hand on the car door, he stopped, and he turned back toward the lights, and he called out one thing across my yard. He said, "Nora, the bank appointment Monday. Do not keep it." Then the door shut, and the gravel crunched, and and the taillights went down through the trees, and that was the last any of us ever saw of Chase Merrill, because Chase Merrill had never existed at all. What happened after is quieter, the way real life is. He waived extradition and went back to Tennessee, and some months on he pleaded guilty up there to the theft from Renee with a restitution order attached, and the last I heard, other counties in another state were sorting out their own paper on him, and Sandra, his wife, finally got her divorce the sad way, with him in a jumpsuit. He wrote Nora one letter from jail. She has never opened it. It sits in my shop drawer, and I keep it because Judith told me to, and because someday, if that girl ever doubts that none of it was her fault, the postmark alone will testify. Nora did not shatter the way I feared. She bent, bad, for a while. The dress went back. The license went back to the probate court unused, into the same building where the records had been waiting all along. She stayed at her daddy's old room through the winter, and there were nights I heard her crying through the wall, and I let her hear the coffee grinder in the morning instead of my worrying, because grief needs a house that keeps its routines. Her money never moved. Not $1. The certificate of deposit came due that Tuesday, and she rolled it right back over, herself, alone, at the Farmers and Merchants Bank. And the teller told me later she cried a little, and the teller cried a little, and then they both laughed. And if you do not understand how that is a victory, I am not sure I can explain it to you. Renee drove down twice more that year, once for her deposition that never got needed, and once, in the spring, just for supper. The ring went back north with her, engraving restored. Marty did that work himself and would not take a dime for it, so I squared us the only way I know. I spent February building him a walnut display case for his shop. 40 years of other people's pocket watches finally sitting in something worthy of them. And when he saw it, he polished his glasses for about a minute and a half and then talked about the weather. That is how men our age weep in public, in case you ever wondered. And in April, I finished the bookshelf I'd been building for the children's room at the library, and Nora and I hauled it in together, and when we set it against the wall, I handed her my daddy's level, not to borrow, to keep. She stood it on the top shelf, and we watched the bubble swim over and settle dead center, and she looked at it a good while and she said, "This one is true." And I said, "So are you, sweetheart. You got lied to. That is not the same thing as being a fool, not by a country mile." The bubble was never broken. Somebody just taught you not to look at it, and that is on him, not on you. Now let me sit with you one last minute, friend to friend, before I let you go. I am not going to tell you to distrust every soul who loves somebody you love. That is no way to live. But I will tell you what this old carpenter knows. Fresh paint is cheap, and it goes on fast, and it is always the rotten wood that gets painted first. So when somebody new comes into your family in a hurry, you are allowed to look slow. You are allowed to notice when every fact about a man arrives by only one road, his own mouth. Courthouse records are public in this country, marriage licenses and divorces and judgments, sitting in file folders waiting for one stubborn person to ask. A careful hour at a county clerk's window costs less than a wedding cake, and I will tell you it costs a whole lot less than the things it can save. And if the paperwork of your own life needs tightening, your deed, your accounts, the people named on them, do not take advice on it from anybody who stands to inherit the outcome. Go see somebody like Judith, who gets paid the same whether you are rich or fooled. And above all, mind the say-so. Money follows the say-so out the door every time. Guard yours, and guard the say-so of the people you love, gentle, without stealing it from them yourself in the name of protecting them. That is the narrow board we walk as parents and grandparents, and there is no level made for it. You just check the bubble in your own chest, and you love them out loud, and some nights that has to be enough. It is full dark here now, and the crickets have the yard. Nora is up at the house with the lights on, and my daddy's level is standing on a shelf in a library where children holler, "The table held! Friends!" Build yours straight, keep one eye on the paint and both eyes on the wood, and be the person in somebody's story who locks the door and says, "Before you say one word, you need to see this. Good night from the foothills, and thank you for sitting with me."